This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded in front of a live audience here at the 2016 Limud Conference in Birmingham, UK. My guest today is a philosopher, an Orthodox rabbi, and a Jewish educator. Among many, many other things, he teaches at the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies and holds a research position at the University of Haifa. Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
You can call me Sam.
Sam.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so you deal with both Western philosophy and Jewish philosophy, Goyim's philosophy, if you like. You kind of broke the barrier between the two. And so I'd like to know whether, if asking you which you have a stronger connection to, is like asking you who do you prefer, mommy or daddy?
No, it's not the same, the question, because I don't see a clear and fast distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish philosophy. It's a bit strange to say, like, Jewish philosophy. What would make a philosophy Jewish? Well, what would make a philosophy French? What would make a philosophy English? What would make, we talk about Greek philosophy? Well, it's partially to do with who writes it, certainly. But the Jewish identity is a bit of a difficult one to pin down. You might think, unlike Christian philosophy, you might think it's not possible to have Christian philosophy that doesn't believe in Jesus, because then it wouldn't be Christian. But you can certainly have Jewish philosophy that doesn't believe in any of the recognizable tenets of Judaism, in the sense that secular Zionism is a Jewish philosophy, but it's not tied to any of the tenets of Judaism. So in a sense, first of all, the question, what is Jewish philosophy, is not a simple one to answer. But also, I'm not sure that I'd want there to be a distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish philosophy, because the philosopher is just interested in trying to find out the truth about certain issues. And the truth isn't Jewish or non-Jewish. The truth is just truth. So it is true that my work aims at, some of my work at least, aims at breaking down a traditional kind of academic...
Yeah, because neither I nor you invented that distinction.
Right,
it exists in academia worldwide.
Absolutely, and especially in Israel, where you have philosophy departments and then Mechshavet Yisrael departments, like Jewish philosophy departments. And the thought is, well, when I was applying for work in Israeli universities, because my family really wants to be based in Israel, one university said, why are you even applying to the philosophy department? You do Jewish philosophy. And that upset me. Thankfully, I got a job in a philosophy department at the University of Haifa, but I can explain to you why that was important to me. Because what tends to happen is that Jewish philosophy, when taught in Jewish studies departments or Jewish thought departments, is primarily a historical discipline, like a discipline in intellectual history. So you stand and you learn what my friend and mentor, Eleanor Stump, once called it to me. She called it museum exhibit philosophy. So you kind of roll out Maimonides and you say, who was this man? Where did he come from? Why did he think what he thought? How interesting. And then you roll him off, and then you roll in another philosopher, and who is he? And invariably...
But isn't it the way it's done with, Plato or...
No, I mean, that's the way that Plato might be studied in a classics department or in an intellectual history department. But if we're doing Plato in a philosophy department, our main issue, our main concern is what this guy said right? Is it, does it stand up? Is it good thought? Is it good philosophy? And sometimes we're not. We can even study Plato ahistorically. We can say, look, I don't know what he was thinking because he lived in ancient Greece, but I'm reading his book, and this is what I thought he might have meant, and this is how I can compare it to what contemporary thinkers are thinking. And it's a much more living rather than a historical process. So I don't want to teach Maimonides as a medieval thinker. I want to teach Maimonides as a thinker who I can bring into conversation with any other thinker, whether they be Jewish or non-Jewish. And my training was in secular philosophy, not Jewish at all. My PhD was on the early philosophy of language and metaphysics of Bertrand Russell, who was just this English aristocratic philosopher who didn't have a Jewish bone in his body, as far as I'm aware, and wrote this famous book, Why I'm Not a Christian, and he was very antagonistic towards religion in general. And I continued to write in disparate areas, philosophy of language, philosophy of literature, metaphysics, My problem is I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. I'm writing in lots of areas. But I try to bring all of those different intellectual traditions and interests into conversation with Judaism as a living tradition. What makes my work Jewish philosophy is that I'm in conversation primarily with a certain canon of literature, recognizably Jewish literature.
Mm-hmm. So lead us through your that process. How would you take Bertrand Russell, and where does he encounter Jewish philosophy at all?
So Bertrand Russell's not the easiest example, but I'll give you another similar example.
Please.
Okay, a very perplexing and rich Jewish thinker was Rav Mordechai Yosef Lehner, the Ishbitzer Rebbe. He was a Polish Hasidic thinker in the 19th century. And he has all of these very difficult aphoristic statements about the world being something like a dream that God is dreaming up. And we're something like figments of his imagination. He has other figments of God's imagination. He has other statements where he makes it sound like, and this is consonant with the idea that we're just being dreamed up by God, statements that make it sound like we have no free will whatsoever, because what we do is not up to us. We do whatever God dreams us up as doing. On the other hand, he throws out these statements on other occasions where he makes it sound like everything is radically contingent, radically underdetermined, radically up to us and chancy. And I was stretched. I'm just reading this work as a Jew interested in what great rabbis of the past have had to say. I'm like, what on earth is he talking about? How can I make sense of all of this? And I know something about secular philosophy, and there's a guy called David Lewis who was a tremendous American analytic philosopher in the 21st century, as well. He died, I think, in 2000 and something. And he speaks a lot about, he has an important paper about truth in fiction. And how, when I make a statement like Hamlet was a prince of Denmark, it seems like I'm saying something which is both true and false at once, because it's true relative to the story that Shakespeare wrote, but you can't be. It's also true that Hamlet doesn't exist, and you can't be a prince of Denmark, if you don't exist. You see, Hamlet has many of the qualifications that you might need to be a prince. His parents were king and queen. Prince of Denmark, he was Danish. He was male, so he has the qualification of being a prince rather than a princess. The only one thing he's lacking that stops him from being a prince is that he doesn't exist, unfortunately, for him. I mean, I don't know if Denmark minds this, but what David Lewis gave me, and I won't share unless you have an ungodly interest in the minutiae of this theory. David Lewis provides me with a systematic semantics of fiction. The semantics of fiction would be explaining what it means for sentences to be true in a fiction but not true outside of the fiction. I took that structure in some of the work that I did about the Ishbitzer Rebbe, and I said, well, if the world is just a story in the mind of God, then some things are true in the story and some things are true outside of the story, and sometimes his statements, sometimes the things that the Ishbitzer says have to be indexed to one conversation or the other. And that's basically me using my education in secular philosophy, being in conversation with a Hasidic philosopher who doesn't make much sense on the surface of things, to make maybe a fruitful conversation.
How does this echo with your colleagues? I mean, it seems to me like you're making yourself enemies on both sides.
Look, I'm quite lucky, because I'm coming at a time where, so analytical philosophy, the type of philosophy I do, which is like rigorously kind of mathematical, logical, wedded to the sciences, for a long time it was very hostile to people who had religious kind of sensibilities and concerns. And it went through this time of logical positivism and lots of schools of metaphysics or anti-metaphysics in analytic circles that were just anti-religion. But along came a group of Christian philosophers in the kind of 1970s who did a lot of very important work in logic, modality, different areas of technical philosophy. Two spring to mind straight away. One was called Alvin Plantinga, and the other was called Peter van Inwagen. And they, together with some of their friends, Eleanor Stump, somebody I mentioned already, they were analytically trained philosophers who kind of made Christianity respectable. And the way they did it was... first of all, kind of making a name for themselves in non-religious philosophy, which kind of garnered the respect of their peers. But they also pointed out some stuff, which is that lots of other philosophers today are okay with the idea that we can't prove everything. And that really the job of a philosopher is to show that the things that you do believe are internally coherent and consistent, and that there's no obvious counter-evidence to pull it down from the outside. And they were able to show, just like other philosophers do that, Christian philosophers were able to make their Christianity relatively respectable. And I moved into analytical philosophy, and I spent 3 years in America, where it's quite commonplace now for world-class philosophers to be quite out and open about their Christianity. And I haven't really confronted in America all that much hostility. I think in Israel it's a bit more countercultural for a religious Orthodox rabbi to be in a secular philosophy department trying to peg off like Jewish philosophy as if it was actually academically respectable. But actually I've been really, really warmly welcomed in the University of Haifa, and I'm really grateful to my colleagues.
So do you think it's really, we're seeing now the first signs of these barriers disappearing?
Yeah, I really hope so. We have something called the Association for the Philosophy of Judaism that we started. You can look us up online, and a number of scholars are trying to do work that kind of echoes what those Christian philosophers were doing in the 70s. Not all of us are religious, not all of us are Orthodox, we're cross-denominational, and because there are fascinating questions raised by Jewish identity that you don't need to be a theist to be. But also what starts to happen is, and I've noticed this, that, look, the idea that God exists is a really interesting ontological posit. It doesn't matter whether you actually believe it or not to be interested in what might the consequences of it be. Can you make it rational? Can you make it plausible? So my atheist colleagues can read my work and be interested by it, try to poke holes in it, and sometimes like I've read stuff that I completely don't believe in, stuff about the Trinity or stuff about the incarnation of Jesus from my Christian scholars, Christian friends, and say, though I don't believe it, wow, isn't the structure of that argument interesting? Isn't the way they reconciled this tension interesting? And I can use those stuff in my work, and I'm sure that non-Orthodox or irreligious Jewish scholars and my colleagues in Haifa will be able to read my work and get something from it, even if they don't buy into the fundamental axioms that I'm bringing to the table.
Does it inform your work as a rabbi, beyond the actual research and writing? I mean, being a rabbi means more than just, engaging intellectually.
I am a rabbi, and it is a part of my identity. On the one hand, what happened was I was religious, but I didn't have much of a religious education. I'd done a couple of years in rabbinical school after high school, after non-Jewish high school. And then I went and did my undergraduate, my PhD in philosophy. And it was really my wife, Gabby, who said, you're now an expert in secular philosophy. You have a PhD, but you're not such an expert in Jewish stuff. And that doesn't kind of stand up to our values. There should be parity between your knowledge in one field and the other. So inspired by her, I went back to rabbinical school and kind of evened out the years that I'd spent in university and in rabbinical school. And I didn't do that to become a rabbi.
Right.
It's
just for true love.
Well, yeah.
If that's not true love, what is?
Yeah, but if you are in rabbinical school for long enough, sometimes somebody will throw the certificate at you at the end. Oh, I'm a rabbi now. Because I was there long, I hung around long enough. It wasn't really a concerted plan to become a rabbi. But there is a difference between having students in a university and having students in a yeshiva and a rabbinical seminary, or going around to communities on Shabbatot and preaching, so to speak, right, giving a drasha in a synagogue. That's different, and through those activities I have, sometimes Jews who don't speak Hebrew or not as their first language will use Hebrew words to mark out a specifically Jewish thing. So for instance, the word Talmid in Hebrew just means a student, but I would distinguish between my students and my Talmidim, right? My students are people who I've taught in a university, whereas my Talmidim are people who might come to me more because I'm their rabbi. And the relationship's different, and I love both relationships. But I don't want to be the rabbi of a community, but I do recognize that there are people who go through their lives searching for some kind of relationship with God, and maybe the fact that there's some guy doing philosophy in a secular department who is also an Orthodox rabbi might be interesting to them. And sometimes those people seek me out, and I'm always honored and humbled by that, and I develop a kind of a different relationship with them.
So how does a young Orthodox man, after 2 years in a rabbi seminary, go off to study Bertrand Russell? I mean, it's as far as you you could imagine, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. Some people think that. I remember meeting. There was a girl in Rutgers University who had gone to a Beit Yaakov Haredi ultra Orthodox high school, and she kind of very much dropped out of that lifestyle and ended up in Rutgers University studying philosophy, and she came up into the philosophy department and she sees this rabbi there, and she's like been running away, and she, what's a rabbi doing here? This is like this is the last place you're going to expect to find a religious person. But I don't think that's right. I was in yeshiva for 2 years before university because I had started to become religious as a teenager, but I was interested in philosophy too, and I didn't really see the contradiction that other people did. And my rabbis were terribly scared. You're going to go to university and study philosophy. That's terrible. Your mind will be polluted. And that just made me feel less respect for the rabbis than, because it's as if they were so scared about the product they were selling that the first exposure to some other product was going to run away.
So your engagement with Bertrand Russell didn't affect your faith one bit?
No, it might have forced me to articulate my faith better, or it might have changed the contours of my faith somehow. I explained in another session here at Limud that for me, my religiosity starts off with a relationship. It's a relationship with the God that I experience in prayer and religious experience. And that's something very deep and personal. I can use the tools of philosophy to show how my beliefs are not necessarily stupid or incoherent or inconsistent with one another. But it starts off as you might say in Yiddish, in your kishkas, right? It didn't start in my head. I use my head to make my kishkas make sense, if that makes sense. And therefore, reading Bertrand Russell was never a threat to me, because if I tried to convince you through some skeptical argument, that we're all just a dream in someone's dream, like I actually just tried to do with
exactly, isn't it really the point of philosophy then to raise questions
yes,
and
that's
cast
right.
doubt?
Yes, for sure. But ultimately, if I did that and say, you know what, Gilad, I can make you doubt whether your mother exists. Maybe your mother isn't a real person. Maybe she's a figment of your imagination, right? And we could get you all worried. But you know what? Come Erev Shabbat, Friday, you better ring her. Right, because you're going to get in trouble, right? In a philosophy classroom, it's very easy to make somebody worried. Maybe the world outside doesn't exist, but when they cross the road after the philosophy class, they look both ways, because even though it might be a dream, in this dream, if a car hits you, it really hurts. So they look both ways. And likewise, when reading Bertrand Russell, I might be able to momentarily imagine that God doesn't exist. But my relationship with God is very, very visceral, just like your relationship with your mother. So come Friday night, I'm going to go to shul, because it's real for me. It's in my kishkas. So yeah, it didn't damage me. I hope. I don't know.
All right, we have a bit of time for questions from the audience. Has anyone got a question? Janine, please.
I have a million questions, but I'll start with one. Your favorite Jewish philosopher and why?
My son, Sadia, is probably my favorite Jewish philosopher. He's been keeping me on my toes about Jewish philosophical questions for a very long time. And my son, Sadia, is named after Sadia Gaon, who was kind of the first systematic rabbinic philosopher. There was Philo, who was a Jew in the Second Temple period, who was well versed in Greek philosophy and was a Jew. The Karaites beat the rabbinical Jews to systematic philosophy, but Sadia Gaon was probably the first rabbi in the rabbinic movement to who've been philosophically educated and interested in writing what we would call philosophy today systematically. And though there's so many things in his magnum opus, Emunot V'Dayot, the Book of Doctrines and Beliefs, that I really don't sign on to, I feel like I'm walking in his footsteps. He's like a role model, because he wasn't scared of the confrontation between reason and faith. But that's a very different type of intellectual admiration to the admiration I have for other philosophers whose thought actually influences the content of my thought. Sadia Gaon doesn't really do that for me, but his attitude, I think, is heroic. So he's probably something of an idol. You shouldn't have idols, though. So.
Any more questions? Yes, Ariella, please.
You're teaching now in Haifa, and it's known as being a city that's very mixed, has a large Muslim population, and I think also in the university there. And I'm just wondering how that encounter has been with your Muslim students, if there's, in your teaching, you chose to teach in a primarily Muslim region of the world, or Muslim and Jewish, rather than at Rutgers, where you have the Christian philosophers who have influenced you. And I'm wondering if you've brought that in either your classes or they've brought it in, how that's worked.
Thank you. What a lovely question. Because I grew up in analytical philosophy, the main religious influence in analytical philosophy is Christian. And I have moved to a much more Muslim region, and I have Muslim students. I have started a project with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish philosophers all over the world. I didn't find it. I'm a scholar on it. I've been invited to it, where we're going to be working together in the summers on kind of constructive theistic philosophy. And I'm looking forward to working more closely with Muslim colleagues. I always thought that kind of one of my non-official roles as a religious teacher in a secular university in Israel would be to kind of showcase to Jewish students that it is possible to be religious and academic, religious and open-minded, religious, etc., etc. I didn't realize that I'd have another role in the university setting, which is to create climates in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims come together not as antagonists, not in conflict, but just in conversation in a classroom, in the safety of the classroom, where there's an equality between everybody in the room, because they're all under me, they're all my students. No, that's not what I mean. But they're all coming to the class on equal terms with one another, and we're creating this atmosphere. I think it's a really awesome thing, and I'm watching particularly my Muslim and Christian students. I've only been teaching for one semester so far. I'm new there. But I'm watching them, and I'm just really inspired because I'm seeing the creation of young adults who are going to become constructive citizens of this country that's much more multicultural and diverse than is sometimes presented, and teaching them the skills to think critically about their own traditions and each other's traditions, and to discuss respectfully with one another these sorts of things. I think it's a massive opportunity, and I'm really honoured to be kind of part of it. And I believe that all of the religious traditions and people from without religious tradition have in the past experienced, and in the present continue to experience, the same God. So we have a lot to learn from one another, and I'm excited to be part of a diverse student body rather than what's the opposite of diverse? Uniform student body.
All right, Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens, philosopher, Orthodox rabbi, and Jewish educator, both at the Pardis Institute for Jewish Studies and the University of Haifa. Thank you very much for joining us today. And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host, Dalia Shendlin, will be back with us shortly. But in the meantime, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.